Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight, Middle East conflict, the Israeli experience. The war that broke out last month between Palestinians in Gaza and Israeli forces brought the age-old conflict back to the forefront of the world news. We know this is an incredibly difficult topic, and our goal here tonight is not to go into the entire history because frankly we can't do that in the length of our show. We are also not trying to debate who is right or wrong, nor try to claim that we have the solution. But our 7 p.m. team would like to provide a space for local Israelis and Palestinians to talk about their perspectives, experiences, and impact that they're seeing in their communities. Tomorrow night, we will devote our In Focus conversation to Utah's Palestinian community members, but tonight we will hear first from Utah's Israeli community members. Joining us live in our studio tonight are Ron Zamir. He is the Vice President of the United Jewish Federation of Utah, and Dganit Herzig, Slovik, past President of the United Jewish Federation of Utah. Thank you both for being here tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Glad to be here.
Ron, we will start with you. We'd like to get to know your personal stories. Sure. When did you first, or when did your family first arrive in the U.S. from Israel, and what were the circumstances that brought you over here?
Well, thank you. My circumstance is pretty unique. I was born in New York, actually, and emigrated to Israel when I was 18. But like a lot of American Jews, we all have some kind of connection to Israel, either through the prayers we say or our bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs. We're all somehow connected to that story of the people of Zion, the story of the Bible, and the story of modern Zionism. In my case, I was very fortunate to have two amazing parents who were, one, my mom that was born in Jerusalem, and my dad who was born in Tel Aviv, and amazing grandparents that were born in Israel during Turkish control, and great-great-great-grandparents that were also born and grew up in Jerusalem. So I can take my family back almost 200 years to the old city of Jerusalem.
And Dganit, what about you? What is your story and what is your family story?
So my story is the story of many Jewish people. On my mother's side, my grandmother was actually born in Israel in what is now modern-day Tel Aviv in the early 1900s. Her parents immigrated to Israel from Russia because there were pogroms and they were persecuted there, so they immigrated. On my grandfather's side, he was born in Germany, and in the 1930s, when the Nazis started persecuting Jews, and his family decided it wasn't safe for him. At the age of 16, they sent him to Israel, and that's where he met my grandmother. And my mother was born in the Scottish hospital in Tiberias in 1945, when it was still British-controlled Israel. And on my dad's side, it's not as good, I guess, good a story, not good a story, but an ending, because both his parents lived in Poland and they lost their entire family during the Nazi occupation of Poland and the Holocaust. They survived by joining the Russian army and going to Siberia and spending the wartime in Siberia. And after Siberia, they found their way back to Poland, looked for family, realized no one survived. And my grandmother was pregnant with my dad, and so they started the journey to get to Israel. And my dad was born somewhere on the way. He was on the boat called Exodus as a child, as a 6-month-old child. And the story of the Exodus is that when it reached Israel's shore in 1945-46, the British turned them away, and they had to go back to camps back in Europe, excuse me. And 2 years later, at the age of 2 or 3, when Israel was established in 1948, he was able to make it with his parents back to Israel into safe haven. And that's my story, and that's also why Israel is so important to me, and making sure that Israel is a safe place for Jews all over the world. If there's anything that happens, that there's Israel for them, is what motivates me and why I'm here talking to you today.
Thank you so much to you both for sharing your personal family story. Dganit, I'd like you to talk about the concept of Zionism. Like we heard Ron talk a little bit about it when he was talking about his family story. Can you discuss when it started, why Jews came to Palestine and now Israel?
Yeah, Zionism, the term Zionism is the Jewish national movement's yearning to live in Israel, a yearning that has existed for thousands of years, from when Jews left Israel, were forced out of Israel, and we all know the history of 2,000 years ago. And then there's the modern day Zionism, and that's to find a safe haven in a place where we are responsible for our own fate and we're not under the threat of other nations.
All right, Ron and Dganit, hold that thought. We have to take a quick commercial break. But when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on Middle East conflict, the Israeli experience. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on Middle East conflict, the Israeli experience. We resume now with Ron Zamir and Dganit Herzig, Slovik from the United Jewish Federation of Utah. Now, in the last segment, we heard about your personal stories. Now we turn to your views on the conflict with Palestine. And Ron, we'll start with you. At the tail end of British colonialism, the land was promised to the Ottoman Empire, Palestinian Arabs and Jews. Can you talk more about the modern seeds of the conflict leading to the war of 1948?
Thank you. Well, you know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is pretty unique because as much as we try to look at it from what we see in the news today, it has a lot of roots in the past. You know, when I came to Israel, I decided I would study archaeology to understand the past, but I also enrolled at Hebrew U to study international relations. And what I saw through that experience is that they're all intertwined. When the British took over from the Turks after World War I, they basically made a lot of promises to everybody. They gave and promised land to the leaders that helped them in the revolt in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, you know, and the French promised things in Damascus. And for the Jews, they took a little sliver. I think it was less than 2 or 3% of the whole Middle East, and put it into a document or promise called the Balfour Declaration to promise that as the place for the future homeland or the reconstituted homeland of the Jewish people. Now, for Jews, that wasn't very revolutionary, right? We knew about Zion, we prayed to Zion. Our archaeology, our language is intertwined with that land. You can dig almost anywhere in Israel and come up with remnants of the Kingdom of Judea and Kingdom of Israel. So that is kind of the context. And from, I would say, after World War I, 1917, all through 1948, the British tried a balancing act between the Jews that were coming into Palestine to develop it. They were buying land, they were investing. That investment was drawing in immigrants, not just Jewish immigrants, but a plethora of Arab immigrants that were taking advantage of the formation of citrus groves and the renewing of agriculture. We have to remember that before World War I, there was nothing there. There were some Jews and some Arabs. My family was there already, but it was a very desolate country. It's really only after World War I that the country started to be developing. And that's where the conflict took flight. There were numerous attacks by Arabs against Jews. My grandfather fled for his life from the city of Hebron, where most of his friends were massacred. They then made it to Jerusalem, and after fleeing to Jerusalem, they were kicked out of Jerusalem by their Arab neighbors. My grandfather spoke Yiddish, Hebrew, and Arabic. They lived together, but when the Arab politicians at the time claimed that Al-Aqsa was being threatened, the Jews were forcibly evicted from the old city at that time. And then they fled to the newer parts of Jerusalem in 1936. Soon after that, or close to that, my mother was born, and that developed into a whole situation where you had Jews living on one part of Jerusalem or Arabs on the other, and of course that changed when Jerusalem was reunited in 1967. But the roots are based in history. It would be a mistake to downplay the Palestinian narrative or the Jewish narrative because they have deep roots in the region and have been in conflict for a long time.
Now, I want to get to the war of 1967, but we're running out of time here. So let's talk about Hamas. So Ron, stay with me here. Hamas is an organization whose goal is the destruction of Israel. It is funded by Iran. What are your thoughts on Hamas and how some people believe that they represent all Palestinians?
Well, what people don't realize, the Hamas is a new organization. It came after Yasser Arafat formed the PLO. It came as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a religious fundamentalist organization believing in Sharia law, as opposed to most of the Palestinians that had a political movement. And right now, Hamas, still with its charter and even the amendment of the charter from the 1980s, has one purpose of being, and that purpose is the destruction of the State of Israel and the constitution of a Palestinian state, as they claim, from the Jordan to the sea, which, if you look at a map of Israel, would basically include all of Israel, not just the territories conquered after 1967.
Now, Dganit, talk about the state of Gaza and the West Bank when there is no armed conflict. How do you see the blockades, the walls and border fences, the restrictions of supplies, and on people moving in and out?
Yes, so we have to, again, look at the conflict, not just what happened this past month, but go back. And Israel has left Gaza 15 years ago. Everything. There were beautiful cities there, settlements, agriculture, thriving communities, and Israel pulled everyone out of there and moved them inside what is Israel, and left the land, the Gaza, that strip of land. It's not a large piece of land, but it was left to them to the Palestinians to govern it themselves. And what happened after that is that Hamas was elected, unfortunately, for the Palestinians and for us Israelis, and started a war against Israel. And the just recent conflict is just an example of what has been going on in that area of Israel for 15 years. My brother works in agriculture, and he actually goes to that area to work the fields that he has there. And every month in the past few years, there have been rockets fired that they had to pull away. There have been incendiary balloons that burned down everything that they grew that year. And so, yeah, the wall, whether it's in Gaza or in the West Bank, it's horrible because it's a wall and no one wants wall. We would love to live in peace with our neighbors, but it's necessary to stop the barrage of rockets that have been falling on our citizens. And the hope is that one day we can take that wall down and just live as friends with each other. That's our dreams. That's what I grew up dreaming. That's the songs that we grew up singing, is about just peace coming to our land and stopping the war, stopping the hostility, just living as neighbors, as friends.
And we'll get to that in the next segment. Ron, we have about 30 seconds left. I want to get to this last question. There is a power imbalance between Israel and the Palestinians living in the occupied territories. How do you perceive the force that was used by Israel in the last outburst of violence?
I think Israel did everything it could to minimize civilian casualties, but that doesn't change the misery in that region. And we have to understand, if we're going to move forward, the keys to Gaza are in the Hamas's back pocket. They started this conflict. They were the ones who initiated the missile strikes. They know they are not building bomb shelters for their citizens. They are building missiles that sit in hospitals and in schools. And they know what they need to do to protect their citizens. Yet they choose to continue a conflict based on their version of religion. It's not Islam, or at least it's their version of Islam, and to believe that through hate and perpetuating misery, they will somehow move the needle forward. The asymmetry of power sits with the Hamas right now, because Israel is a democracy. Israel will not move inside to save the Palestinians from their own leadership. They can. All they could do is defend their Jewish and Arab citizens from missile attacks.
All right, Ron and Dganit, hold that thought. We have to take another quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our in-focus discussion on Middle East conflict, the Israeli experience. Welcome to our third and final in-focus discussion tonight on Middle East conflict, the Israeli experience. We resume now with Ron Zamir and Dganit Herzig, Slovik from the United Jewish Federation of Utah. In the last segment, we talked about your views on the conflict with Palestine. Now we turn to your hope for the future. Ron, last month's outburst of military violence was the result of a series of events, as seems to always be the case. How do we stop the chain reaction from happening?
Thank you. There is a cycle of violence, and we have to understand that the cycle of violence is being led by the leadership, not by the people in the region. The current escalation by the Hamas is a direct result of their infighting with the Palestinians on leadership of the Palestinian political movement. There was no reason for the Hamas to shell Jerusalem because they had nothing to gain from it, and they have gained nothing. You know, all the pictures you've shown in between our segments of this death and destruction and of misery are a direct result of an unnecessary act that achieved nothing except strengthen the hand of the Hamas vis-a-vis the PLO and Abbas, and also got them more funds and more support from countries like Iran. The fact is that the whole region is going in a different direction. The Abraham Accords and other things are telling the Palestinians and the Israelis it's time to end this cycle. Yet we are still dealing with a radical regime recognized by the US and of Europe as being a terrorist regime that is leading their own people astray. Every scene of destruction could have been avoided. Israel has no territorial aspirations for Gaza. Israelis want to live in peace. They are trying to defend their people. And we, as Utahns, see that and talk to our families in Israel and realize what they're going through.
Ron, talk about the recent changes in Israeli parliament and what it could mean for the future of this conflict.
Well, let's turn an optimism on this show right now. For the first time in Israel, the left and the right, the Arabs and the Jews, are forming a coalition to solve the hard problems that Israel has. Not just the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but economic issues. This is a government that's being formed to break an impasse. You have people that are to the right of Netanyahu sitting down with people that are way to the left, you know, of Netanyahu, all with one purpose, to bring stability to the state of Israel. The real challenge here will be, what do the Palestinians do with this opportunity? Do they squander it like they did when they gave up on the peace plan by Clinton? Do they squander it when Arafat launched the Intifada as opposed to getting 97% of what he wanted in a state? I think Israel is primed for an initiative, and now it's up to the Palestinians to take up this gauntlet. They are forming a government with Arabs, okay, to break the impasse. What will happen on the other side? Let's be optimistic, let's pray, and hope that that leads to a better tomorrow.
Dganit, I want to turn to you. Talk about a two-state solution. Do you feel that Palestinians should have their own homeland? And is there political will to make it happen on the Israeli side?
The answer is yes. Palestinians should have their own homeland next to an Israeli Jewish homeland. And that has been the aspiration of every government that I'm aware of during my lifetime. There's always been, ever since 1967, when Israel was forced into the conflict, into the war that ended with Israel taking the territory of the West Bank and Gaza, Israel has been trying to find a solution, a way to return it, and a way to let the Palestinians govern their own people. We have no desire to govern over people who do not wish to be part of Israel. And so the answer is yes. I wish for them to have their own country. I think the majority of Israelis wish for them to have their own country. There's no doubt that once that happens, and hopefully it'll happen soon, the lives of both Palestinians and Israelis would be so much better.
Ron, I have about 30 seconds left. Parting words, final thoughts. What would you like to leave our viewers with?
Empathy is the challenge here. we have to realize that when we look at Israel from here in Utah, it's only when the two sides with each other, when the mothers in this conflict look for a better solution, I believe this conflict will end. And I'm hopeful. I think we should all be hopeful, and that tomorrow will be a day with less death, less destruction, and less misery for all the people on the side of this conflict.
It's been very hard for us lately. Thank you both so much. You've been hearing from Ron Zamir, Vice President of Community Relations, and Dganit Herzig, Slovik, past president, both from the United Jewish Federation of Utah. Ron and Dganit, I know this is a personal and emotional topic for both of you. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight.
Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you so much, Rosie.